get it up on Facebook here. All right. Preparing to stream. All right. And we are live on Facebook. Awesome. Welcome everyone. My name's Elle Lively. I'm the Executive Director of Michigan Music Alliance. I'll be moderating this 60-minute session about contracts and which ones do you need to know about as an artist. And we'll be covering the basics, kind of a 101. And we've got some great panelists I'm really excited to hear from today. As always, these are archived, and if you have follow-up questions, there is contact information in the info below. But let's go ahead and get started. Chris, do you want to kick it off? Just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you're involved with MMA too.
Sure. My name's Chris Newber. I am on the board of the MMA, so that's how I'm involved with MMA. It's been a pleasure. I'm also an attorney in Grand Rapids at the Rodenhouse Law Group, where I practice a bunch of different civil things. Entertainment is definitely one of my primary focuses because I'm such a music lover and a fan of all things entertainment, really. Before I became a lawyer, and it's still to this day, I'm also a musician. Toured and played with the band Gunner and the Grizzly Boys for the past 12 years now, I think, which is crazy. So it's been fun kind of comparing my real world experience to my theoretical knowledge on the law and all that, and trying to help other people not make the same mistakes that we made in the past.
That's awesome. Thanks for being here. Eric, do you want to tell us a little bit about you and what you do? And
yeah, I'm right now. I'm a recovering artist manager, I guess. I started out my world working on the live side in Colorado at Red Rocks, and if anyone's ever been to Red Rocks, then they'll understand how that kind of drags you into the music business one way or another. And that took me to, I eventually worked on the production side here in Colorado, went to law school out in California, worked at Endeavor Agency long before they ever even thought about having music, before they joined with William Morris. Then realized that management was really my thing, and worked at a management company called The Firm with a bunch of big acts out in Los Angeles. And when that company started growing, it was 15 people when I started, it was 75 when I left. And I just saw that it was going to fall apart, and I really wanted to do something different. So I started my own management company, and my business partner's father produced movies. He produced Raging Bull and Rocky and a bunch of other movies. And so he wanted to help our company, our management company, but he didn't want to just give us money. So he hired me as an attorney to work with some of his film projects. And so by default, I guess what we used to say was I used to practice law to support my management habit. And if you've ever managed artists, or Chris, as an artist yourself, you know that that's peaks and valleys, it comes and it goes and whatnot as an artist or as a manager. And it just turns out that, my management world turned into a legal world, and it grew, and I ended up moving out to Nashville and started teaching at Belmont. And I transitioned to where I still have a couple of management clients, but my legal work has taken over for that. And in addition to that, just this last year, I took on a full-time gig as the assistant director of the new music business program at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. And so I guess I'm sort of a multi-hyphenate, but I look at teaching and practicing law as very much the same thing. And Jeremy, I don't know if you agree, I assume you may, but my practice of law is generally very collaborative and very hands-on to the point where I'm not the person you go to and say, here, get this done and just do it. I'm the person that will explain to you why I'm doing it, why something is. And frankly, even if it's something that I don't necessarily agree that you should do, at least you understand why you do something that's not necessarily within my agreement. And so I don't know. That's a ramble on version of I've done way too much stuff for the amount of time I've been on this planet, but I love it all. And I'm just trying to keep on eating as much as possible from the music business, plate as I can. And, to the extent that I've been invited to do things like this and help out people in other parts of the country, I love doing it.
That's awesome. Thank you. I love the to support your management habit. That's real. Jeremy, what about you? Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm currently an assistant professor of music, focusing on music business and entrepreneurship and arts and creative industries at Wayne State University. That's in addition to co-owning the record label Quite Scientific. Before that, I was the director of music licensing, essentially running the music publishing operation at Ghostly International. I'm probably the only person, the only panelist here that doesn't have a JD, but in practice was doing a lot of business affairs work in coordination with our councils, I guess I should say, kind of doing all the prep work and then getting the okay on a lot of that work. But yeah, I do agree, Eric, the level of explanation and practice sort of feeds into my teaching these days, as I'm sort of giving them business advice, not legal advice, of how they can be more aware of copyright and of contracting methods and negotiation practices, either as a prep for their own possible legal career, as a future law student studying entertainment law or IP, or just being a student who is mildly aware and who can hire one of y'all and you guys can have a cogent conversation.
That's awesome. Joe, tell us about you.
Hey, I'm Joe Voss, and I appreciate you saying that, Jeremy. You didn't pass the bar, but you know a little bit, so that's good. I am an entertainment lawyer. I'm sitting in Kalamazoo, Michigan, but my law firm is a boutique law firm in Chicago. I have been practicing media and entertainment law in sort of all different stripes for 20 years now. And I particularly, I got my start sort of doing entertainment law, working for musicians that were engaged in social justice and social change practices. So a particular area for me are what we call artist cause collaborations. So when there's nonprofit organizations that are trying to sort of fill their mission with media, that's where I work, and where entertainers or creative practitioners are working with nonprofits, that's a space where I live too. So what that means is a lot of production and financing legal for documentary and independent film. And I work with a good number of music artists who are licensing into film or want to license into film. And so and that means in Michigan, there are not that many of us who hold out our shingle and work in media and entertainment, and so it's a pretty small club. So it's good to meet Eric from outside, and Chris, it's good to meet you too, locally. So and I just want to give a shout to Elle and MMA, because it's sort of always on point and such a great resource. So I appreciate being here tonight.
Oh, thanks for coming. It's kind of nice because these sessions used to be in person, and I think we'll get to that point again. But the huge added benefit we have of the virtual realm is we get to have people like Eric and we might not be able to get you out here on a random Monday evening. So this is really cool that, the pandemic has made a little silver lining of making all of you more accessible to artists in Michigan or wherever people might be. So that's very exciting to me. We have a few things that you guys want to talk about, but I really liked the first bullet point on the list here because I think it's something that people don't think about. And I would guess majority of bands might not have. It's a project or a band contract. And Chris, do you want to kind of kick it off and give us a once over on that?
I'd love to. Yeah, I talk about these very, very often with people who call, and it's kind of like speaking a foreign language sometimes, and I understand that now. So like, I guess as a preliminary matter, when you start a business, if you've got an LLC, even if you don't have an LLC, you need to sort of have some governing documents. I mean, if you want to be able to get a bank account, you need to, and you want to do it through an LLC, you got to have articles of organization, you got to have an operating agreement and an EIN. That's what gets you a bank account. That's what makes your business entity work for you from the very first day. Outside of that, we also want to be able to govern what happens inside of the company. And that doesn't show up in any state filing. That's a contract that you have, with the partners. If you're a solo act, all you need is an operating agreement. That's an agreement between you as an individual and you as a representative of the company. It's important to have because, you're going to need it to get a bank account. You're going to need it, eventually one day, but it's going to be easy to change because, there's not going to be any resistance if you want to change it. More importantly, a partnership agreement or a band partnership agreement or a band agreement, it's kind of one and the same there. That can be perhaps the most important document that a band has if you've got multiple people who want to be owners. At a very basic level, a partnership agreement on its own just kind of lays out, who the partners are, what percentage interest they own in the company, what happens if they want to leave the company or if they're fired, what happens if you want to bring somebody else in. In the context of a band, we want to focus on things that are more band and music specific. Obviously you want to establish who the members are because that's kind of the most important term, really. You want to know what percentage they own because that's always going to, matter when it comes to distributing funds. Who owns the intellectual property? Who owns the master recordings? If the company itself owns the masters, who gets to take those with them? Who owns the name? Does the name stay with the band? Does the name stay with a particular individual? These are things to flesh out. When it comes to members leaving and joining, what happens if a member quits? How do we handle that? What happens if everybody wants to fire a member? How do we handle that? Is it a majority vote? Is it a unanimous vote? Is it something else? And then also importantly, when somebody leaves the band or the company, how do you compensate them? Because, if they're going to sell you their interest in the company, they need to be compensated somehow. Pretty technical issues. They a lot of these things don't really seem to jive or make sense with the creative mind because they're all very theoretical and they're very stiff rules. But I think with enough talking about it, we can figure it out. But it's a super important document to have because it rules out any reasonable question about the band members' rights with respect to each other.
I can give a real quick practical example that sort of highlights that. Not that what you said at all, Chris, is impractical, but so in my previous experience working at, I'll just say one of the two record labels that I was a partner or a part of, there was an artist who hadn't sorted out a lot of these details, the splits and ownership of IP, before they went into studio or even during the recording process. They hadn't sorted out writership amounts. They hadn't sorted out who owned what and how much they participated in royalty income. And that was fine for a long time. They sort of just split it up equally. There was no paperwork, but it was all handshake. It was all great. And then they got a massive advertising campaign using their music. And long story short, the band blew up. They never released another album afterward. And it was very problematic for me, who was running the music publishing company, to try and go back and fix and re-register things based off of all these assumptions that were never really based in fact. And it was just a huge hot mess.
Yeah, what other kind of situations could, befall a band potentially? What kind of other things maybe that Chris hasn't mentioned yet can be put into contracts like that? And what kind of agreements?
I can give you, unfortunately, I hate to start with a horror story, but they seem to be the most interesting and entertaining. I have an artist I was working with here in Nashville, and I was sort of on a bro deal, tip pocket type thing. It wasn't really a client, it was somebody that I'd known as a friend, and suggested to them over and over again, we need to go ahead and set something up, got to get something set up. They're like, they're too busy with their own lives or writing songs or doing their own thing, but they never got around to actually setting up anything formal. And so they never had any band structure. And at one point, then the band called me in and they had a band disagreement. And one of the band members wanted to eliminate one of the other band members. And as it turns out so the guitar player tried to get rid of the keyboardist, and the drummer and bass player turned around and said, well, we don't really want to do that. If you want them gone, why don't you just leave? And it turned into a big kerfuffle. Well, the big problem is that, so they're all asking me, what do we do now? I said, well, the problem we have now is that in the state of Tennessee, you're a partnership, whether you want to be a partnership or not, even if you never form one. So you're now under Tennessee partnership law. You don't get to determine what's going to happen. And Tennessee partnership law means that everyone has to be a unilateral vote, a unanimous vote to eliminate a partner of a partnership. Well, if you've ever tried to get a partner to eliminate themselves, it can be very, very difficult. So what he basically decided he was going to do is just agree not to participate and help, except for the very limited amount that he needed to. And of course, and Jeremy's story is pretty common. So what happens is the band breaks up, everyone goes their separate ways, and all because they didn't have some sort of agreement. If they just simply sat down and wrote something down that said, if we have a disagreement, we vote, and the person who's being voted on doesn't get a vote, we would have changed the entire whole situation. That band might be together today. Instead, the guy ended up moving over to England and the whole band fell apart.
Yeah, that is kind of a worst case scenario. Are there any other types of provisions that you can put into a band agreement as far as an actual legal contract goes?
Well, one of the things that I think about in this is this discussion. So as practitioners, we're meeting people and they're living and working in the real world. And the example that I'll often use is a little bit simplistic when I'm talking to bands. And it's the sort of Springsteen and Radiohead models that we sort of use, right? So Bruce Springsteen basically just approaches kind of his way of doing business as a band is, hey, I'll take care of everybody who's in this, but the buck stops with me. And so that's one version, right? And we run into that with bands who have, if there's particularly a front woman or a front man that is part of it, that's one model. And we can tailor these agreements, and those agreements are pretty simple. The buck stops with Bruce is one model. And then you've got another model, which is sort of the way that Radiohead has done it as a band, right? Which is everything is split equally. And they do that with all of these things that Chris and Jeremy and Eric have mentioned, right? Which is basically, look, how are we going to make decisions? How will it work? And everybody gets a 25% sort of share in that Radiohead model. And that can filter through all the provisions of the agreement. That can filter through how we're going to do distributions, if there's money to distribute. And they do that actually they did at least for part of their time with all their songwriting too. It was sort of like a split sheet sort of scenario that was just ready made. Whenever they got in the studio together and they made music, they split it amongst themselves equally. And that just gets rid of a lot of this ambiguity that I think Eric and Jeremy and Chris to some degree are sort of pointing at, right? Like, how are we going to make decisions? So we can translate this stuff as attorneys into these agreements, operating agreements or partnership agreements or what's there, but it really matters how this sort of band wants to operate and see themselves. And it starts from real practical spaces that you have to take a band through, right? And the other thing too, like one of the things that I say as a lawyer, and I say this kind of all the time, is that the lawyers tend to be where the dreams go to die, right? Hey, this is going to be great, and we got these deals, and it's awesome, and it's going to have handshakes, right? And we're here to say, like, all right, but what if the whole thing falls apart? What are you going to do? And these, the folks on the panel have these horror stories. We all sort of have them. You see them and they're sad, and it's like, wow, the world's deprived of that music because they didn't want to do a operating agreement, like they didn't want to make the agreement work. So I'm into, like, all right, what is this vision? How does he want this thing to live in the world before, essentially it blows up, because it's going to blow up. It's like, it's humans. So trying to, like, blend the legal with the practical on that is kind of my approach to it.
Yeah, I agree with Joe. I had the band The Far Side had broken up several years ago, and a couple of the former band members got back together for a Rock the Bells tour, and we ended up writing a band agreement just for the tour. Think for example, like something like the Eagles, obviously much lesser situation, but where we basically came up with a very short 3-page agreement, and they kept it in a drawer on the tour bus. And when they came back from tour, they told me how they pulled the thing out about 6 times and referred to it, and it kept them going, and it made it through the tour. And I was very, very happy that we were able to make that happen, because without a set of rules that you set up when you're friends and when you're agreeing, then it's hard to look at it later when you're having conflict. And I mean, we've all been through those situations.
Absolutely. Yeah. To Eric's point and Joe's point before, and of course, Jeremy's point earlier, the band agreement is there to resolve conflicts. The most important thing is to have the conversation first. The contract itself isn't going to make you all best friends. It's just going to make sure that there's a roadmap or at least, some sort of indication of what you previously agreed to. So when you're friendly early on, before you have $1 million contracts in front of you, maybe it makes sense to hash these things out. And I know, in my band, luckily we did that pretty early. I mean, probably a couple years in, which is not very early if you're only a couple years old as a band, but now it seems pretty early. And it wasn't that difficult of a conversation to have. It's just like, okay, let's just split it up equally and we'll sign it and we'll be good to go, and then as things change in the future, as people start to feel like maybe they deserve more, or maybe this person deserves less, or, this or that, you just can point at the document and say, look, guys, this is what we agreed to. If you don't like it, then we can talk about amending it. But right now, this is the way things sit. And that way it doesn't have to blow up into a worse argument than you already said you'd do it, you
make a great point, Chris, to have the conversation before it's a hard one to have. And so if I just started a band, or maybe I've been gigging with the same group for a couple of years, and I don't have an agreement like this, what are the first steps that I should take to kind of start the process? What do I do next?
I'll just jump in with something real quick right now. I think the first thing really for anybody is deciding, do you want to be, if you're a front man, if you're the front man or front woman of a band, or the leader of the band, do you want to have partners? I think that it's a valid decision for people to choose not to have partners and to be a sole business owner in that sense, and to hire people on perhaps a contract basis and pay them like that instead of partners. And some people prefer to be paid like that because, you're not subject to the risks of profit and loss. but otherwise, I mean, I think usually most bands, when they're having this conversation early and they know they want to be a partnership, it's almost just like splitting it up equally. And I think that's a fine place to start. If I were representing the lead singer, lead songwriter, front person, I'd probably have a different opinion. But I think it probably makes sense to start at equal and see where you can go from there. But I'm interested to see what other people's thoughts are.
I think it's a foundation that you can start off. If everybody's friends and they feel like it's an equal partnership to begin with, it doesn't have to necessarily say that way. I think you made a nice point about amendments. It's not set in stone. I mean, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to change, but an agreement can be amended. It's not a forever thing, but it's at least you have a basis to operate off of when the argument on the tour bus, like Eric mentioned, comes up.
I would say if there's one clause in any band agreement, and actually I stick with this for management agreement, anything else, but my favorite clause is the cooling off period. It's that period that you allow time for everyone for cooler heads to prevail, so that you don't just say, screw you and walk out the door and slam and your band's done. Having a 15-day or 30-day or whatever period where you're kind of required to come back to the table and, hold your head and hat in a hand and say, hey, let's try and work this out, because these are important relationships. These are important agreements that we don't want to make them so throwaway that they're easily disposable. And I feel like that cooling off period for both management agreements as well as for band agreements is probably one of the most important things. If I had no other clauses in my management agreements with my clients other than that, that would be the one that I would definitely have, except for maybe the amount that they're supposed to pay.
Well, that's I appreciate you saying that, Eric. I mean, I feel like that I add to that too. We will at least try to get together at least once, right, to talk about it before. I mean, one of the advantages we have when I'm doing stuff in Chicago is that there is a great creative, it's Lawyers for the Creative Arts, and they have a mediation program. And so I like to insert that too, as, hey, the parties will take this to something, like that. We don't have, that's not available everywhere, but it's a good one. But I do like to use the provision that says we will try at least once to sit down and talk about this. I mean, I think everybody kind of on the panel is alluding to this, like the idea of the intent of these agreements is to go into a drawer, and we're going to make art, right? And you don't let the tail wag the dog. These I mean, a great notion I have and sort of understand is like in the music business in particular, anybody besides the artists and the audience, anybody else is just getting in the way, right? And so how do we as practitioners, right, sort of stay most out of the way and make sure that key relationship happens? That's what everybody's in this for. So these agreements need to give peace of mind, go in the drawer, figure out a way that we're going to talk and make sure we're relate as humans, and then you can make art, right? But as soon as this stuff and this conversation drives what happens, we're starting to lose things. We're getting in the way of it. So, yeah.
Those are always the most difficult negotiations or back and forth that we had over rights at the label and the music publisher, were the ones where it seemed like the contract was driving the situation and not the creative, and that it wasn't trying to sort of I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this, but the creative wasn't leading the finished project, and then the deal terms were sort of the focus. And I'd say more than half of the time, those partnerships, whether they were trying to sign someone or trying to do a license or whatnot, they fell apart because there were too many roadblocks for small artists or a label or publisher with something else to do to pay attention to.
And that's a great segue, Jeremy. And I would imagine you probably have dealt with this quite a bit working for labels. kind of sorting out the rights and transferring rights and the record deal, like who's getting credit, when are we deciding that, the whole 9 yards. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experiences with that? We can kind of go around and touch on it.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff to think about, and even us at Two Small Independent Records didn't do necessarily our bona fides all the time of getting everything all signed with side person agreements and guest vocalists and writing shares, and to cover all of the all those situations. We were, small startup companies that we were doing our best, and sometimes those issues came back to haunt us, and we had to sort out those conversations over cover art, or the transfer of rights for that, or the license of use of that, or the right to use somebody's name as a featured artist, after the fact, after something got popular or an artist got a nomination for something. Those things came out of the woodwork, if you will. And so it pays to have those conversations ahead of time, and it pays dividends to invest up front. I'm not saying that hiring lawyers is inexpensive, but it's a really, really worthwhile investment, especially if you don't feel like you have any sort of basis to go from. And usually, this is what I tell my students in my classes, you can get an initial consult. I'm not speaking on anybody's behalf here, but you can get an initial consult for free and then figure out the terms of a relationship after that.
Well, Joe already mentioned the Michigan Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, and I've done work for Colorado Lawyers for the Arts, as well as Tennessee Volunteer Lawyers and Professionals, or whatever the heck their name is this week. But I don't think that there's a major metro area that doesn't have some sort of volunteer lawyers for the arts, because there's certainly lawyers in every area that are voiced in that area that want to work in it one way or another. And I think that it's amazing, I find, though, how many artists aren't aware of it. They and I think it's, organizations like you guys, like the Music Michigan organization, that Al, that you guys making artists aware of it is a great thing, and I'm glad you guys are doing stuff like this.
I would say that, so I was referring to Chicago Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, and the Detroit and Michigan as a whole doesn't currently have something. It did, but it's definitely an opportunity. Long story, Eric, we could talk about that, but when we did run Lawyers for the Creative Economy here in Michigan, this was a great place to put it, right? We would do these and have these discussions, and to this point, I've actually tried to work with a lot of, and I have several studio clients, right? And talking with people, and studios are run, by engineers, but for the most part, right? But I like to use this method called strewing, which is like, hey, how would you feel about a few form sample split sheets just being around the studio? And just so that maybe when people are in here making stuff, they could, at least for the sake of the label, just do a split sheet on the tracks that they're making and writing. And just sort of like, hey, what if we just had this idea, right? So the labels love it. And it's just sort of, it begs this question, right? This conversation. And I think several of you have referenced this, like, well, it's way harder when it blows up, right? Because 25% and zero is always going to be zero, but 25% of, something is going to be something. So it's easy enough to say, let's understand each other and let's see what happens. And so that's the thing, like, that's sort of the idea, right? It's really difficult. It's easier to do it in the studio, right, than doing it after the fact. And it's even easier to do it before you even go into the studio. But that's the idea. I think that's maybe a theme that emerges from what we're saying, is like, have these conversations early and often, like that's the idea.
Yeah,
Also,
if
to
the data's done wrong, you're in trouble. You're not going to get paid. Your money's going to a black box. You're never going to see anything.
Very true. And since we're already talking about being in the studio, producer contract, and what does that look like, or what should it look like? Why have one, and who qualifies truly as a producer?
I'll start with this one. I think that one is probably going to be more technical of a contract than we can really cover generically here today, because everybody's going to approach it differently, right? Like, we've worked with producers in the past, through my band, is several different ones. Sometimes they just want $2,000, and like, that's all. Like, you pay them $2,000 and they'll, like, produce your like a couple records for you, or something, like a couple songs for you. There are people who want something more formal. There are people who want points. Like, these are not unusual asks, but there's no way that we could possibly cover all of them right now. Usually, when you're talking about a more complex producer agreement, there's probably a label in the picture. So hopefully they're kind of looking out for your rights by way of their rights. You know what I mean? I think obviously making sure that the intellectual property remains with the band, the group who's recording it, is 100% crucial. And shouldn't, that shouldn't ever appear in any production contract, hopefully. But yeah, I don't know. I think just keeping an eye out for the method of compensation, how a producer is to be credited. And if we're talking about more of like a pseudo engineering agreement that's called a production agreement, maybe like how many track revisions you get, like, realistically, what can you expect from this person? If we're not talking about a major label type of release.
Are any of you guys seeing spec production deals anymore? I used to see them all the time, but it seems really rare now that the cost of production has gone down.
I didn't see any in my 14-year career at a label.
It used to. I mean, it's sort of, I don't know if it's quite gone the way of the advance, which, I haven't seen in a long time either. But yeah, it's not so much, right? I mean, one of the things, maybe just to take it up a level from this, is like, anytime somebody tells you as an artist, hey, this is the standard producer agreement that everybody uses, that's bullshit. So there is no, like, I am allergic to the idea of, hey, this is the standard, this is the way everything goes. I mean, deals are cut so many different ways that you can throw that out, right? And it's a discussion we have with clients a lot too. Hey, we just want the standard, band agreement or whatever it is. I'm like, okay, that isn't necessarily a thing. And I mean, there's just a million ways to cut a different million deals, and so I don't see any kind of industry standard around it, and I encourage creativity and am challenged by that too. So you can make it your way.
I mean, I really like, kind of building off what Joe said, you're trying to figure out how to define what production actually means. Is that person actually performing writing in the studio? Are they rearranging, or are they just adding new sounds or telling you that you got the best take? Or are they rewriting the hook? It's a lot of different things that producing could be, and there's a lot of different compensation for that. So we'll practically, and not as a lawyer again, I try to tell students and people that I advise to look at defining what those terms mean, or what those words mean, very specifically, and then trying to sort out what is actually going on with those people. The contract, that the boilerplate or standard terms in a contract, I agree with Joe, are BS basically, and that you really should try to figure out what what service you're providing, or what service you're getting, or what you want to see in that agreement, how you want the band to operate, how you want yourself to be represented, and get that all honed in. And maybe that's a conversation between you and your label, you and your manager, you and your friends, and then you can give all that information to a legal professional and have them build out an agreement that totally represents you. and your artwork for that matter.
I hear that term industry standard a lot when in reference to like a booking contract or a management contract or even a contract with a booking agent. I've had people be like, well, I've never seen one of these before, and this looks like the ones online. So, you know, is there anything I should look for? I get asked that question. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, so please answer that better than me. What things do you guys think are like normal things that you would see? And let's talk a management contract specifically, or a booking agent contract. What's normal? What's a red flag? And is there anything normal, I guess, that might be in every contract?
I hate the word
Managers taking
permanent.
copyright. Mine was managers taking a copyright ownership percentage or taking any ownership of IP.
Huge red flag there. I mean, there's a bunch, but this is the thing too. I've also seen legit, I mean, you know, like particularly in the Midwest, right? So when we sit and fly over country, right, which we can embrace and be fine, but the people on the coast tend to push us in ways that I hear a lot, right? And we actually play the sort of, hey, now I'm no big city lawyer, but it seems to me, right, that this is like these terms aren't fair. And that's the thing too, is where it's really difficult. And Elle, to your point, like where we do get questions of people saying like, well, are these rates right? You know, is a manager 10% manager? Is a manager 25% manager? I mean, I see the numbers all over the place and have to have the conversation of like, well, what are you actually getting? There may be a universe where 50% gross might be okay if, you know, the manager is doing, you know, different things. I mean, Eric, I'm interested in your perspective on this stuff, particularly around management, right? Because you got to have it.
Well, I've noticed a lot of strange things, and it's recently. And first of all, and the word, my big buzzword is anytime I see the word perpetuity, I stop and I take another look, and you know, anything that's just a problem for me. Nothing should be forever. That being said, I think that any argument, it's weird because I'm a very pro artist manager and individual, but yet I'm also somebody who will defend the 360 deal in some regards, because I understand that if the record label brings in assets, if they put skin in the game, then they should participate in the proceeds. I get it, you know? So I'm not a deal killer in that regard. I also have plenty of clients that come to me and say, I want to get the best deal I can. I want that record label to bend over. And I'm like, you don't want your record label to go out of business, man. I've seen it happen, and it's really bad for you when your label goes out of business. It's not what you want. You want to have a collaborative relationship with them. So as a manager, I always try and look at, and I guess a good example would be to tell you the one I've seen the most recently. I've seen a lot of people really asking for longer sunset clauses. And there are some good reasons for that now. The main reason being that payment for sound recordings is being extended because you're not getting that money on your sale initially that you would, because it's streaming. So your streaming payout of $1 million is going to be much longer period of time than your $1 million on and I talk about $1 million because I'm thinking back in 1999 and 2000, not a year like now where you have one album that sold 1 million copies and it's Adele, you know. But that kind of conversation, I've always just tried to understand, if you can tell me why, if you can explain to me why this is as a manager or as an artist, then we can have a conversation. My biggest pet peeve is, and I'm sure we've all dealt with these managers or lawyers, where someone just says, you know, that's a good point, but I don't think so. Or I'm just not going to do it. Now that infuriates me. When you have someone who just sticks to their guns because that's the way they've always done business, that's the way they're always going to do business. And frankly, they feel like they've got the power and they've got the, you know, the big dick, and they're going to go ahead and I hope I can say that, I just did, and they're going to go ahead and throw it on the table, you know, and that's the most frustrating part, because I do think that collaboration and transparency are the key words for the business going forward.
I can agree with that too. I mean, the reason why and understanding too leads me to have these conversations with artist clients in particular who are considering a label deal, which has been something I've looked at in the last couple of weeks. Of just my conversation with the artist is like, all right, talk to me about your trust in these people, right? Like we can do whatever we're going to do on this deal, but how are you feeling about these people, right? Are you calling me because you red flags went on for you and you think they're getting over on you? And you know, it's a different approach than like, all right, yeah, this is a small label, they want to help us out, our interests are aligned, you know. So I can look at the agreement, and this is what managers do, right? Like, how are your interests aligned? As long as your interests are aligned and nobody's getting paid unless we all get paid, right, then I can feel better and have to dig less deep into every term of the deal. And again, this is the thing too, this is something I like to explain a lot, or at least sort of identify for people, is like, there really are not many people that win a lawsuit other than lawyers. When you're in litigation with stuff, it can take a long time. You know, if you want to go really high up the mountain, it's like you're going to deprive people of this art, right? Because it's going to get tied up. And so again, it's a tail wagging the dog situation. Don't let these contracts actually bury creative content. Like, let's get them into the world and make them fair.
Yeah, I think to that point, if you're working with a manager who's not willing to flex a little bit on their contractual terms, it's probably a sign that they're not a good fit. You know what I mean? Like this should be a collaborative relationship, and it shouldn't be hard to come to an agreement on, you know, what should be relatively basic terms, even if they are industry standard. And on that note too, my opinion about whenever somebody tries to tell me that something's industry standard, I feel like they're trying to pull the wool over my eyes. And a lot of these contracts are wolves in sheep's clothing. You know, just to really quick go back to the production contract. I work with artists in the hip hop space here in Michigan because they're the ones that seem to be blowing up and calling me the most, I guess. But they'll, you know, when they've got the A&R guys from the majors contacting them, there's also all these sort of independent production companies who send these production agreements over, and it looks like, oh, cool, yeah, you know, I can work with this guy, they'll record my music. You look into it, and there's like a 9-year right of first refusal, and it's basically just a 360 record deal, which means that, you know, the production company in the contracts I've seen is going to be able to keep 50% of every dollar you make related to your art for the next, you know, X number of years. So you want to be careful that you're not just going off the title of the contract, but also looking into it. And Eric mentioned the sunset clause. I think that's an important one in management contracts. That's basically the clause that designates the manager's right to receive income after the management relationship is terminated. And it's a decline. It's usually a declining percentage over a period of years. I think that's a pretty important clause. I know when we were working with our manager, that was the one thing that he was kind of talking about the most. And, you know, we went back and forth on it for a while. Otherwise, you know, in looking at management agreements, a lot of them seem to be devoid of what the manager's actually going to do. How do you sue a manager for breach of contract when there are no terms that definitively, you know, establish what their contractual duties are? So, I mean, if I were an artist right now, if I were representing an artist entering into a management deal, I'd want to get very specific with what the manager is going to do, and possibly even set certain objectives that create an option for the artist to get out. Now, again, that's a very pro-artist approach. If I'm thinking about it from a manager's standpoint, obviously I want to avoid that conversation, but you know, knowing what each side is fighting for kind of gives you some insight into what terms are important to them, and you know, how you should be fighting to bolster your own rights and protections.
Yeah, I mean, having triggers and thresholds and whatnot that you're trying to reach are very important. That's a good way to get a manager to actually accomplish what you're trying to get. On the other hand, what sometimes I hate when an artist, they're, you know, that phone call you get. I need a manager because I need to get a deal. I got to get signed. I mean, God, I hate that phone call. Because at the end of the day, the artist is going to be the one that takes them where you're going to go. A manager can put you in the position to succeed, but a manager can't make you succeed.
I mean, I think that's a good point. Elle, maybe you pointed at this a little bit too. And this is something I have just working and living and being in not necessarily huge media markets, right? The idea of the manager, the difference between a manager and a booking agent, right, can be pretty blurred when there aren't markets or venues that are working sort of booking, right? There aren't booking agents that work, and that role is definitely different. But managers, right, who are working in these smaller markets will actually be the ones that are doing the booking too, right? So you have this, like, I mean, maybe not to your extent, Eric, of being a multi-hyphenate, but like people are definitely doing more than just sort of what the lanes are. And we see it in the bigger markets too, as people stay in their lane. I mean, particularly in, when we look at the sort of teams around talent and managers and agents being very different. And, I see a much more blurry line for the duties of what people are doing in a smaller market.
That's really true, Joe. Especially like I feel a lot of newer artists who maybe just had this one other person on board and maybe they're wearing a lot of different hats and getting some help that way, they're going to probably want to have these conversations really early on. That definitely is the theme of the evening, and make sure you know what the expectations are on both sides before you really get into something where you're going to have a lot of confusion potentially in the future. And that kind of brings me to a random question that I feel is really relevant, especially this year. With contracts between a performer and a venue, how have you guys seen those change because of COVID-19? And as a general best practice, if I were to go, get a contract for a performance somewhere tomorrow, what should I make sure is in there, given the state of the world today? What should I make is in there for my own best interest as an artist?
So one of the things that I did early in the whole COVID-19 thing was amend our booking agreement. And we didn't get any phone calls for shows in 2020, really. So I didn't get to use it for a while. But, we've been using it more lately. There's in these booking contracts, you'll have what's called like, a cancellation clause for sure. And then usually like a force majeure clause, which, talks about like acts of God and stuff like that. It's not quite specific enough, in my opinion, to address COVID-19. So I actually, in our contracts, just added a COVID-19 clause. That was kind of a combination of different clauses I read online, plus some of my own language to kind of make it watertight for us. And it's basically an out button for us. It's not that we necessarily expect. It's not that we necessarily expect everybody to act in accordance with that contractual provision, but it gives us an out if they don't. And it's like, whoa, this is like getting sketchy here. You know what I mean? Like if they're just blatantly disregarding, safety, whether it's an order by a local or state government or just a general safety protocol, we have the option to back out and keep our deposit. And I don't want to enforce it. I really don't want to, but it gives us the option. And that's what a contract is for, is I guess having the option and having the ability to enforce if you need to.
The deposit's nice. That's nice. I mean, not necessarily.
You got to get the deposit. Yeah.
Standard too. I mean, for me, it depends on who we're representing. So if I'm representing venues, I've got a different approach to it whether I'm representing an artist. And on the venue side, I just sort of say, hey, as long as we are following the guidance, there's no, and the show goes on, you can't get out of it. But I, like you, Chris, I have expanded, the sort of standard force majeure stuff and try to include a cancellation, based around COVID. I mean, I think your point though, I mean, it's really nice to have a deposit if you can have that luxury and that gets paid, and the show can go on and you can figure out a way. You know, it's definitely Wild West vibe around what people are doing and how shows are getting canceled. And it takes some real bravery to go out on tour right now, especially if you're going to go from place to place. So, yeah.
Well, you can come to the South because, you know, being in Nashville for most of COVID, it was a little different, and not something I was in favor of either. But certainly, I think the country handled things differently regionally, and you know, we were having, unfortunately, in my opinion, we're having shows, you know, almost throughout the whole thing. That being said, I did do some work for some companies in Florida on the venue side. And yeah, the main thing is to make sure that you're up with whatever the municipalities are asking for and making sure that you're covering yourself in terms of what the legalities are so that you don't have, you know, Daytona Beach coming in and shutting down your venue and not letting your New Year's Eve thing go forward. But the key is to also just to make sure, I mean, just try and keep people safe. And that's the key.
I've got a couple questions from viewers. Here's the first one. Between artist and venue, how much are you seeing language like seeking mutually beneficial solutions?
I mean, I try to use things like that too. I think we're sort of shading around that of saying, hey, we're going to talk, we're going to meet. And so I don't see it that often, but I like to throw it in.
We tried to put it in all the time in our agreements, so both quasi and ghostly, because it was part like a core fundamental belief. Like, if we could be partners, this is probably going to work better than if we are adversaries.
I think from a litigator's standpoint, there's not a whole lot that a lawyer can do with that language in a lawsuit. But that's not what we're shooting for. Well, I mean, we're setting up the contract so that we can actually make the deal work. You know what I mean? So, yeah, the lawyer side of me says, what am I supposed to do with that? But like the artist side of me says, yes, let's work together and make it work. Like, I mean, I'm not going to sue you over $1,000, $2,000 contract anyway. So let's just make it happen. And yeah, we should be working together in good faith and collaborating to, you know, to make the show as good as it's going to be.
That's my favorite. One of my favorite production company clients, video stuff. But they came to me right away and like, hey, can you just put the "be cool" clause in there? And I said, well, what are you talking about? And it's like, just, you know, like, be cool. Like, we're just gonna be cool. And I think of the litigator side too. Like, what the hell am I gonna do with that? You can't sue me for breaching of not following the "be cool" clause. But
I think we literally had a clause like that in the quasi agreement for a while when we were starting
drafted one before. Yeah.
I mean, it'd be kind of fun to argue about in court.
I think the manager in me loves the Fonzie clause or whatever I guess you would call that. But the lawyer in me just sort of would roll my eyes a little bit. But the manager in me loves it.
And then we have another question that kind of goes back to talking about production contracts a little bit. It's from Canon Elizabeth. She says, so if you're paying a producer a fee per song, would they still present a contract that they are taking a percentage? So I guess maybe to reframe that question, and she can correct us if we're wrong here, but you're paying a fee per song and additionally a percentage? I might be understanding that.
I think that's pretty typical. I mean, it's not typical in the contracts I've seen, but like, I think if we're talking about like a large contract, what you're going to see is a producer wants points. They want their production points, you know, which is a percentage of the royalties that come after. But they also might want a flat fee, whether it's something that is recoupable out of the royalties or whether it's just a flat fee down. And again, it's one of those contracts where it is one of those types of contracts where it really just depends on what the parties agree on. But I mean, the issue is if it's not going to be if it's not going to be a knockout song, like does it really make sense to negotiate about royalties? You know, I mean, does the producer really think that they're going to produce something that great? If they do, then maybe it's not. You know, maybe it's worth thinking more about.
It's a lot easier to do these days too with splits, because your DSP can send your percentage directly to the producer and you don't have to worry as much. It used to be you were having to put faith in the artist that they were going to ever show up and pay you, which was a lot of faith that a lot of times didn't get repaid. But I see this, I guess, a lot of times where you have someone they'll either take an advance, and an advance is against their percentage. So when you say a fee, you're really talking about an advance. Or sometimes what I'll do is I'll take it. Let's say you've got someone who's an engineer as well as a producer. They do both jobs. Well, I'll try to make sure that a percentage of what they're being given as a fee is a non-recoupable engineering fee, because you just save money on engineer. Yeah. So why not give them that benefit?
Awesome. Thanks, guys. I want to start wrapping it up with something that we touched on before we went live, and that was, how do you go about finding the right lawyer? How do you know when you're ready? And what should you expect? What should you expect as far as etiquette for those consults too in the beginning, and exactly what kind of resources might people be able to use to find the right lawyer?
Well, I'll say you're doing a good job with MMA, right? I mean, this pulling together lawyers and putting lawyers in front of people. But I, like Jeremy said earlier, I mean, I typically will give people an hour, right, just to see if something is there. And an hour is a lot. You won't get that in a lot of markets, but it is something that I will do just to sort of see what's going on and see if we can get to know what people have going on. I mean, it's important just to remember too, I guess, for artists, is that this stuff is really not intuitive. This is not, you're not expected to know how to work with lawyers. And I think, from my standpoint, you should find somebody that knows your business. They don't necessarily have to love your art, but they need to sort of know their way around the spaces. And I think, this, one of the things it's like where, the lawyers where the dreams go to die. I also say a lot too, like clarity is kindness. So if you say what you're going to get and you do, what you say, that stuff is important. And it's with lawyers and anybody, and so you can expect that stuff from lawyers. It's okay to expect the lawyer is going to do what they tell you that they're going to do for the amount that you're going to pay. So, I mean, those things that might govern your relationship, and then you feel like, oh, I'm talking to a lawyer now. Everything I know about relationships and business and communication is thrown out. Don't throw it out just because we had to go to law school, right? And the gates are up and we went through them or whatever. This common sense stuff applies to lawyer-client relationships too.
I would just, from my side of things, I guess, it's just, don't be fibbing about things or like puffing up facts or misrepresenting yourself when you're in this relationship, because especially in this start of the relationship, because the lawyer that you're hiring is supposed to be your advocate to other people. And if they're misrepresenting you because you're misrepresenting yourself to them, that's just a whole host of problems.
I think one of the biggest things, and I learned this when we kind of changed our marketing company for our law firm, but it's just that people don't know how to find lawyers. And like, it got me thinking, like, yeah, if I had to go find a CPA or even like a roofing contractor, like, I'm going to Google and I'm going to, see the top search results, but it's not going to be indicative of like who's best and like who's most qualified necessarily. It's tough. I think that when we're talking about entertainment law, it's like 50% law, 50% knowledge of the industry. And, don't quote me on those percentages, but it's profoundly industry knowledge that governs this practice as opposed to other practices. And you can go to your uncle's buddy who has a law firm and knows how to read contracts, and they can read a contract, and they can read an awful contract in terms of its numbers and its percentages, and tell you that, oh yeah, it's a watertight thing, it's fine, feel comfortable signing it. But like, if you don't know what a typical agent's percentage should be, or like what a typical manager's percentage should be, or like what the acceptable terms might be, or the acceptable range of terms, what's the point of having the lawyer, really? Because they could just be signing you up for a great contract that's going to screw you over one day. And so I would just say, reach out to people, search for entertainment lawyers. I mean, searching for a contract lawyer, there's all kinds of contracts out there. It's not gonna help you really find a good entertainment contract lawyer. There's some in every city. We got 4 on the screen right now. 2 of them are in Michigan, and there's even more in Michigan.
3.
We're not hiding from you. We'd like to work. I love working with musicians, and like Joe, I give free consults. I love talking to musicians, and it's a passion. So that's why it's easy.
I mean, everything I've ever gotten has been word of mouth, I think, and not that it's not to be self-serving, but I think just talk to other people and find out who makes them happy. I mean, I'm sure Chris has worked with other lawyers with your band and whatnot, and the one thing that I agree with both things that you said, Chris, that one is that talk to people, find out about that. And the other thing is, we've all sadly worked with the artist or the other party that brought the real estate lawyer to the table, who was someone's cousin's uncle's brother. And that is just freaking miserable. It's a nightmare. You have to teach them how to do it. They don't know what they're doing, and they try and they tend to try to be overzealous because they don't know what they're doing. And there's nothing worse than a deal killing lawyer. I'm sorry, but some people love it, so I think everyone is going to have your own passion. I know people who want a lawyer that's going to go out and slay for them. I also know people that want a lawyer that's going to make deals no matter what. And then I know lawyers that are somewhere in between, and that's probably where I fit in. But I've hired lawyers that are bulldogs. I know if I need a bulldog, I know who to call. But it ain't me. I'm just going to be honest with you, because that's not me. I don't kill at all costs. I'm not a scorched earth guy. But I know when it's necessary, and I'll find that person to do it.
Yeah, we hired 3 or 4 different lawyers based off of what we needed out of the situation, and they were very different mindsets and very different situations.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. The practice of law is so broad. Like, just because we have a JD and a license to practice law doesn't mean that we know how to do everything well. There are people who are really, if you wanted the scorched earth guy in Grand Rapids, come to me. I could probably tell you who to go to. You know what I mean? If you want the guy with the velvet gloves, I could probably tell you who to go to. And that's the advantage of having an in to the legal industry in your area. And maybe the best way to get that, if you're considering shopping for an entertainment lawyer, is just find somebody who's a good fit for you. Somebody, maybe they don't get the music, but they get you. They appear to be an advocate for you. They're fighting for you, and they'll answer your phone calls or return them if they can't answer them. And with that, you at least have a foot in the door. And in terms of timing, I'd say get one early, because a lot of us are working, initially at little or no cost with early artists. And, the contracts that you form early are going to be the ones that follow you the whole time sometimes. And you want to make sure those are solid.
Well, I want to kind of start wrapping it up. I think the biggest thing that I heard from you guys is, fix problems before they happen by having conversations and getting your ducks in a row and figuring out who is a duck and who's a goose before you get into situations where you have to have harder conversations and even use those contracts and agreements. So that's my big takeaway for the evening. Thank you for sharing with us and taking your evening and hanging out. I'm going to put everyone's contact information below. So if anyone wants to reach out and ask additional questions to these guys, that is their prerogative, and some great collaborations can happen. And also, in Illinois, Joe was talking a little bit about the organization. I forget the exact acronym. You can fill it in for me, Joe, if you'd like.
Lawyers for the Creative Arts.
Yes. I did research a little more while we were talking. There isn't anything like that in Michigan currently, but as we mentioned before, we have some great options right here. So I'll make sure that your contact information gets routed to our website as well, so that artists in Michigan who might be on MMA's resource page get directed to you guys as well. So thank you for all of the consults I know you'll be doing with people after this. And thanks for supporting Michigan music. And I hope that we see you guys again soon on another panel. It's been really informative, and I think we have a lot of content that we can break into more specifically from here. So thanks so much, and I hope everyone has a great holiday.
Same, thank you.
Thanks, Al. Take care.
Bye, guys. Thanks.